So, thank you so much, Claire, and now it's my pleasure to introduce our next three distinguished guests to the stage. My colleague, distinguished law professor Alex Klass, and two Public Utilities Commission chairs, our own chair, Nancy Lange of Minnesota, and our visitor and guest, Commissioner and Chair Ted Thomas of Arkansas. Thank you so much for being here and welcome. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to moderate this panel focusing on energy storage from the regulator's perspective. I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota Law School, and I teach and I write in the energy law area. And we have two wonderful panelists. Both are chairs of their respective public utility commissions. We have Chair Nancy Lange of the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission and Chair Ted Thomas of the Arkansas Public Service Commission. And both also hold important leadership roles within MISO and other regional and national organizations. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves in more detail in a moment. But first, to open up this panel, I really want to highlight the very different regulatory landscapes that exist in the states. Some are traditionally regulated, some are not. Some have made great strides already on energy storage, others not yet. Some are in RTOs, some are not. And so there's different electricity resources available and under development, different politics, different stakeholders. So some of the questions for this panel will focus on the role of state regulators in supporting and regulating energy storage with an eye towards some of those differences. Which differences really matter? Which ones don't? And how can states address energy storage issues in terms of learning from other states, working with stakeholders, and gaining technical expertise in this constantly evolving area? And so now I'm going to sit down in one of these comfy chairs. I want to set up my classroom like this with the chairs. We can find a lot more chairs, I think. And so we'll start with some introductions. Chair Lange, you want to start?
Sure. Please use the mic. Yes, please. Yeah, just flip it on. You see a blue light when it's on.
All right. I think it's wedded to this thing here. Oh, there we go. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me to this storage summit. Happy to be on a regulatory panel with Chair Thomas. I always think he makes great, innovative, provocative remarks. And I have been on the commission since 2013. I think since that time, storage has really exploded in its point of discussion at energy conferences. We hear more and more about storage. We hear more and more about its capabilities. And I'm just looking forward to the discussion today.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Ted Thomas. I'm the master of no trade, or jack of all trades, master of none. I've been a legislator. I've been a prosecutor. I've been an ALJ. Now I'm a commissioner. I was also the public defender at the State Mental Institution for a while. And all of the things I've learned through this experience has helped inform me, and I look forward to the discussion. And thanks for having us. It's very important. This is how we govern ourselves. And for the students here, this is where it starts. If you want to be involved in policy, you have to learn, you have to study. So thank you for being here and participating.
So we've asked each of our speakers today to give, a couple minutes of just some opening remarks on this issue, just to set the stage, and then I'll ask some more targeted questions, and then if we have time, we can take some questions from the audience that I think will magically come up to me on note cards. So, Chair Thomas, you want to start?
I'll talk about innovation generally, and then at the end, we'll kind of steer that in the way of our specific topic, which is storage. I think when you think about innovation, it occurs in cycles where the disruptor becomes the disrupted. And if you think about TV, then we had VCR, then we had DVD, Blu-ray. They're all kind of in a linear line, and then streaming on the internet. It bounces along. The innovation is replaced by a new innovation. The regulated monopoly model is not really conducive to innovation for two main reasons. First, a regulator doesn't want to fund speculative investment. We saw that in telecom. The technology existed, but regulators don't want to invest in that which might not pay off. Second, the utility does not want to share profits if it thinks of the next big thing with ratepayers. They'll spin that off because they benefit from the next big thing. It's very hard to align those interests in the regulatory model. But retail access states and the RTO markets for long-term capacity, in my view, have yet to demonstrate that they're a superior model in attracting long-term investment of long-lived assets with a short-term price signal. The regulated monopoly model generally places both the risk and the reward of price fluctuation on the ratepayer and not the utility. The benefit of a utility asset that produces below market energy flows to the ratepayer. The opposite is also true. The detriment of a high cost asset stays with the ratepayer. The cost of the asset that's out, that's called stranded cost in utility jargon. You to think about the advances in telecom where you have 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G, and now 5G. In the regulated world, 1G has to be paid for. Even if you move to 2G, ratepayers are still responsible for 1G, so your economics are a little different. Markets are very good at phasing in technological innovation. Both the seller, in an open market, I mean, if you're in the communications business, you can't sit there and inflexibly think, well, I got to pay for 1G before I build 2G, or somebody else is going to come in and eat your lunch. You got to stay on the edge. And then from the consumer side, also, there are different kinds of consumers. There are early adopters, the guy that went and bought the $6,000 flat screen TV that you can now get for $700 5 years ago. You see that all across. And the discipline between the market, the seller, and the buyer, it phases in technology. So how do we reconcile our desire for innovation with what to me, and preserve the benefits of the regulated utility model? The first thing to do is recognize that the advantages of the regulated model apply to generation, not other aspects of the utility business. And if you think of wind and solar as the disruptor, if you put solar panels on your roof that you want to last for 20 years, 2G happens in 20 years. In telecom, this happened in 25 years, 1 to 5. That's 100 years on the generation side. The capital cycles are longer, so on the generation side, innovation is slower. The interface between the customer and the utility and technologies related to customer control of demand are not, in my view, long-lived assets where stable rate recovery is needed, which is the basis of the regulatory model. What if we use the regulated monopoly model to universally deploy smart meters? We have a universal system and a standardized data package that everybody has, and then permit third parties to use the data to market demand response projects to consumers subject to reasonable privacy concerns. This would, in essence, deregulate the interface between the customer and the utility with respect to technologies related to customer-controlled demand response. These purposes are kind of two kinds of data. One I call big data, then the other is individual identified data. If you have all the data from all the users without their names and addresses, then you can analyze that and you can learn a lot. For example, you could overlay it with temperature data outside and temperature data inside. So as the leakiest house, you could identify the 10,000 leakiest houses in your service territory and target those for efficiency. Another thing you can do is figure out the biggest differences between base load and peak, where those savings. You can identify that using analysis and then go get the names so you can pitch it. Of course, that's where the privacy concerns come in. And you could have a whole conference just on privacy. The other thing you need to do if you do that is you need rules so that groups of customers, this is called aggregation, so groups of customers can participate either at the RTO level or participate in a utility offered time of use rate. For example, somebody's business model might be, I'll give you $10 a month on your bill and you'll give me 2 degrees on your thermostat that I control. Because most people don't want to mess with this. I mean, the people in this room probably do, but most people don't, right? Then that person would take all of those thousands of names and then they can do all of the utility economics, market stuff, and all of that. That way you're simplifying and automating this demand response stuff and providing benefit to a consumer that doesn't want to be a utility a utility economist all the time. Opening the door to any new technology through the business opportunities you would get from opening the data, that you could give the Amazon.com experience to customers that want it, and the other ones wouldn't. The changing expectation of customers or part of the customers. Of course, there's a privacy loss. I mean, I have a cell phone because I like it. If something happened to me where I was either a victim in a homicide case or the perp, what's the first thing they want? My cell phone. They want to see who I talk to. They might want to know what, and it's all there. I've sacrificed a lot of privacy for that, but I like it. I do it anyway. The folks that want that kind of experience would have it. Our largest utility asked to display smart meters. There was a settlement that presumed that the utility would control usage of the data. The commission asked questions. What about opening the data? Responses were had, and now we're decision making. And let me do the disclaimer. I kind of look at it with 2 tracks. I'm not to prejudge because I've served in a judicial capacity, and people that come before me are entitled to a fair hearing. But on the other side, participating in policy discussions like this is important. So for any parties involved, my essential approach is if you think you hear things that you like, you better not rest on your laurels. You better get in the record, because we make decisions based on record evidence because that's what the law requires. And reverse is also true. If I've left out something, if there's a chink, or if I, vague policy stuff, and you get it in the record, we're going to make our decisions on the record. So how storage fits into that is, it has, to me, there's all of these technologies that will in some ways complement each other, in other ways compete. Do I want me and utility to try to figure out what that is? Or do I want to open up to third parties in the business, people with experience in other states? And that's where storage can plug in. Both as storage as complementing participation in a utility time of use rate, or as storage in a group of assets that's bid into the RTO market. A couple of other random thoughts. Just sort of speaking, the notion of economic dispatch is critical in discussions of storage. That's how the utility decides. It takes the cheapest, and as the load grows, it turns on the next cheapest resource, and when the load comes down, it does the same thing. I want you to imagine in California, 17% of their power is provided by solar. I want you to wave the magic wand, and we have that in the largest utility in Minnesota. And I want you to plug a battery into every one of those in imaginary. The way economic dispatch works, the solar would almost never charge the battery. You'll be releasing the battery to meet the peak. The storage and the solar will both be putting power on the grid. You want to charge the battery when it's cheapest and discharge it when it's most expensive. And to the extent that solar matches the peak, it doesn't match the peak, but it's more correlated to the peak than the average hour, you're not going to store when it's expensive and then use it overnight when it's cheap. You can't tether it like that. Similarly, the traditional utility analysis, you have generation, you have transmission, you have distribution. And the notion is, well, we have to figure out which one of those boxes storage is and ram it home. But that's wrong too. The potential is because it's flexible. That's what the benefit is. You can't shove it into a box, but neither can you tether it to a particular asset. Another thing that's very interesting about that you can't separate is EVs and storage, because an electric vehicle is a consumer-owned mobile storage device. It's a co-benefit. People, if you go buy a car, you're not buying it for that, and co-benefits move the ball on economics, because there's this other benefit. And of course, you need aggregation for that too, because you're not going to have utility economists sitting there figuring out when to plug in and when not. And the problem in California is different than everybody else, because they get that valley when the solar's all going, so they want you plugged in at work. You know, everywhere else in the country, you need to be plugged in overnight, and those are generalizations. But the EV offers a whole lot of potential. Final word, the model often used to make the argument that changing is inevitable is the telecom. And when you see how it happened, but I would submit there's another possible model where you can identify all of these broad social benefits, but it really didn't happen, and that's public transportation. Whenever you have innovation that involves consumer acceptance, the consumer has to come along. If we're going to get the benefits of markets driven by consumers, there's got to be something for all the consumers. You can't really take a market and then try to push everybody to get the social benefits. You just haven't seen that. I hope you've heard some of this, because I just heard the mic pick up. But that the consumer is very important, and that has to be in part of the equation when you discuss the inevitability of change. I'll turn it over to Chair Lange to say a few words about her. Very fortunate to meet her through a process called MCER. She's one of the best commissioners in America, in my view. This was, if utility commissions were sports franchises, you wouldn't trade her for somebody else's commissioner. You just wouldn't. So, Chair Nancy Lange.
All right, thank you. So we move from Arkansas to Minnesota. Chair Lange.
Oh, there we go. That's great praise coming from you, Ted, and I'm sure there's a lot of people in this room that would willingly trade me really quickly. It's like, get her out of there. And before I begin my remarks, I'll just say Chair Thomas really identified some key points that I think regulators are thinking about with respect to innovation. We are not the model of innovation, but yet we know we have a tremendous role to play in that. And 3 words stuck out. One is data, one is third parties, and one is aggregation. And we all have a role to play as commissioners in those 3 areas. The other thing he said is benefits for all consumers. I think one thing, I just returned from the eSource Forum in Denver, and it's a lot about delivering customers what they want, become the Amazon, become the Google, they're going to eat your lunch as a utility. And I think that is true for a subset of customers who really want that innovation and that flexibility and that choice immediately. And that's going to come, I think, eventually for all customers, and hopefully in a seamless way, so they don't have to be making minute-by-minute decisions. It's going to be an automatic thing for them. But as regulators, we still have to think about the customers that a lot of people don't want to serve. And at the end of the day, we have to balance those interests. But getting back to storage, if the stars can align for storage, and I think those are stars like deployable technology, cost, and policies, it really does change the game in how we use and price energy. And I think we see movement toward the alignment of those stars. On the cost side, battery storage costs have declined, as Claire Moeller talked about, and are projected to continue to decline. In Minnesota, hot water storage is already cost effective. And as Chair Thomas pointed out, you charge when it's cheap, and that's what we're doing with hot water batteries. We're supercharging them when wind is plentiful at night and not needed. So one side of the equation is trending in the right direction for more storage deployment. But as identified in the report from the Minnesota Energy Storage Workshop, there are significant economic headwinds. How wholesale capacity prices, or low wholesale capacity prices, low prices for ancillary services, or no prices for ancillary services in MISO, and inexpensive capital costs for traditional capacity resources, gas CTs, to name one as an example. As Claire Moeller said, $3 gas has changed the game more than anything in MISO's footprint. State policies are advancing the deployment of storage, either through statute, like in Massachusetts, or through regulatory commissions, like in California and Oregon, as just a couple examples. Some states are putting storage incentives in place, Nevada, New Jersey, Maryland. And storage is emerging as part of integrated resource planning discussions in states and can be evaluated as a capacity resource. Although, as Chair Thomas said, this shortchanges storage to some degree because storage, as he said, you can't just ram it in a T box, a G box, or a D box. It has a number of flexible operative characteristics. And we don't yet have the markets or the metrics to adequately consider all the value streams from storage. As a deployable technology, it appears to perform very well in its ability to deploy almost instantaneously to respond to a grid signal, and I'm thinking about battery storage. It's performing in both large and small scale applications and is flexible. It can be part of microgrids, it can be paired with solar, it can be used by customers to manage their demand charges. And most storage projects being deployed today, though, are in front of the meter, not on the customer side. Interesting. So at a June conference, and I see Kieran here, we heard from 4 battery manufacturers and distributors, and we heard that the problem is us, the problem is regulators, the problem is policies, and regulators need to get on board. So I think as a regulator, as Ted said, we have to think about how we can advance innovation, get out of the way of innovation, but we ultimately have to think about how storage can serve as an economic resource. The analysis of batteries plus storage shows that it can be economic with natural gas combustion turbines if the federal investment tax credit is considered and if environmental externalities are added in. That's really very dependent on federal policy and state policies. And how will it fare in comparison with other capacity resources like DR, demand response, energy management technologies? What if utilities begin to partner, as Ted said, sharing customer data in such a way that it can be used by third parties to deliver capacity resources? So the regulator model and innovation and storage. I really look forward to the discussion today.
Great, thank you both. So, Chair Lange, you talked about some initiatives going on in some other states, and we've talked about some differences in regulations and policies, but for each of you, where do you see energy storage playing a role in your state on distribution level, utility level? There's many boxes it can fit in, and maybe think about that short term and then longer term, but again, specific to your state.
Well, we already see storage happening in Minnesota at the electric cooperative level, and it was referenced, the Connexus project. GRE has deployed among its members massive amounts of solar hot water battery storage. Why are they doing that? Because they don't want to buy expensive capacity from GRE. They have the flexibility to reduce some of their demand and pay less to GRE. That's a good thing. So we see that happening already. Our largest utility, Xcel Energy, proposed a solar battery project to defer a substation upgrade that they needed to make. Interesting idea. We needed more data on it. And I will say, since that time, the costs for that project have, I would assume, come down because the cost of batteries have come down. So that's another thing about innovation is when do you make an economic decision to test to understand how storage is going to work on your system, or deploy in a big scale way, knowing that the costs are going to continue to come down. So those are a couple examples from Minnesota.
Great, thank you. And Arkansas?
Thank you. Our starting point is, with respect to any new technology, what we want to try to do is knock down all of the barriers except for price. That's what we're trying to do. And there are three kind of ways. One is resource planning, but resource planning is challenging because you're trying to figure out what's going to happen. You don't have a price. If it takes you 5 years to build a new large plant, you don't know what the prices are going to be in 5 years. There's risks and benefits to that, but that's one place where what you have to try to do is through your resource planning process, plug in, how do you get a valid apples to apples comparison between efficiency and a new gas plant, between demand response and a new gas plant, between these alternatives and the alternative that the utility is proposing, which it might not be proposing anything without load growth. Another point, that this stuff gets phased in by the operation of price. The prices where it's happening are high. And the price in California is twice the price in Arkansas. It's about 8 cents a kilowatt hour. It's about 15 cents there. So if you have an innovation that's 10 cents, in California you're thinking, yeah, this saves us money. Well, it doesn't in Arkansas. It increases cost. But that gives us the opportunity to sit back and watch as others take the early adopter risk. And if we can develop policies that knock down all the barriers except for price, then those best practices can flow automatically when individuals, actors, not just the utility, figure out that they think the price is right, or it's moving in their direction, or the policy is moving in a direction. So you have utility planning, then you have an RTO market, and then to me the third thing is the utility time of use. What you need is an aggregation rule so people playing the time of use game can plug storage into that. You need the RTO market, which could be efficiency, it could be demand response. It's a large market. You can be a player in any state and you're selling into that market, and then they have a price that's, there's enough data behind it, it can't be gamed. And to me, I see three main values. One is the time value is associated with storage. Charged when it's cheap, that's one value you're trying to capture. The second is the instantaneous. When you have a gas plant, it's all this steel that's spinning. It's called spinning reserves. And if you cut the gas off, it doesn't stop. It keeps spinning. And the gas comes back on. It might go down a little bit, but that gives you, with solar and in some instances wind, when it clicks off, it's instant. What storage complements that, because when you turn it on, it's instant. And that's what's called ancillary services. You have the primary service, which is capacity and energy. Then the ancillary service are voltage control and frequency control. Thank you. Which I stay away from the engineering stuff. I do the accounting and economic stuff. Those are ancillary services, but storage can do that. But then, as Chair Lange mentioned, right now we don't have a market for that. Now, MISO is doing a market redesign, which will probably conclude a real-time market, and that's a value chain. And FERC recognizes, FERC did a deal, it can do so many, storage can do so many things, but you have to have economic rules that value that flexibility. You can't get paid for doing two things that are opposites. And I think FERC in its order did a pretty good job balancing those. And the third is reliability, extra reliability. Now that's a broader question. How much more reliability do we want to pay for as the broad market? Now some people have to do it, like a hospital or a military base. And there's things we can do with policy. You need your early adopters. There's things hospitals have World War II era diesel fuel generator backups. You can beat that potentially. You'll beat that before you can breed it in a broader society. I mean, what we probably don't want is to pay to have reliability for everybody the same way they has to have it in a hospital. Some people might want to do that, but that's a significant cost increase. So, thank you.
Thank you. So, since we have regulators with us, I'm going to ask, and we have some questions for a little bit later. How can state commissions, how can state regulators best support energy storage? Open new investigative dockets, respond in particular ways to utility requests, be receptive to pilot projects. Some things you can initiate on your own, but in other situations you have to respond to whatever comes to you. So thoughts on that? Chair Lange?
Utility commissions, as Ted have said, need to be thinking about storage, I think, both in the testing and piloting phase. Ted's saying, hey, we can kind of virtually pilot by watching what happens in other states, see what their deployments are doing, look at the grid impact of storage, look at the cost impacts of storage. I think we can also and should also do it in our own state. I think our utilities are careful about their systems, and I always think as a regulator, pilots and testing are important, and I also think there's a time to stop pilots and testing. You know, some people say on time of use rates, we've had so many time of use pilots that, you know, what more can we learn? I do think in storage we can learn. I think what is a commercially deployable pilot or a pilot that's of sufficient size that it does start to not only tell utilities, state regulators, but also MISO what this means. And so I do think actual in-the-ground testing in Minnesota makes sense. How do we look at it through a resource planning process? In Minnesota, we have a really robust resource planning process. Some would say it's too robust, but we have it, and I think it delivers a lot of value for our customers. So how do we think about storage in a resource planning process when we, as Ted said, you know, guessing about what the price will be in 5 years? 5 years ago, we didn't know wind was going to be, you know, 2 cents a kilowatt hour necessarily. How do we know what those other value streams are? But we can make assumptions and we can test with sensitivities. And I also think that we need to think about how rate design at commissions is going to impact technologies like storage. I don't know, do you have much time of use in Arkansas?
We do in one jurisdiction that has smart meters. It's one city.
Yeah, we have very limited time of use in Minnesota, and we're exploring that both at the commission and through a pending pilot coming from Xcel Energy. So rate design and pricing signals is going to be an important part. How do customers respond to that? What other technologies do we need to deploy to make the best use of rate design? Minnesota doesn't have any AMI other than in the Minnesota Power Territory. There's a portion of that. So I think there's integrated pieces that we need to be thinking about at the commission. And some of it is driven from us out, and some of it needs to come to us with, I think, some clear signals that the commission wants to test and explore some of these things.
Chair Thomas?
Okay. The utility business is fundamentally an engineering business, and it's important to get started because you learn a lot after you've already deployed. For example, with MISO, when the wind first came along, they did analysis. Okay, we get to 25% in any given hour, everything's going to go crazy. Well, now they hit the 30s all the time, and it doesn't go crazy. It's not that their initial analysis was wrong. It's that as you do it, you learn, because it was different. You didn't just have to forecast load, you have to forecast generation, and you do that and you learn. We identify opportunities to get started so that that learning process can begin. Then we got to integrate with the IRP, which is challenging, and to me the aggregation question is very, very important. That puts a lot more minds on it. you group customers together in demand response, and the person running that group who has an obligation to deliver is going to need a backup plan. And that's where storage can come in. And time of use rates have been around a long time. The economics is there. What's happening now is the data is catching up with the economics, which is why I think the data stuff is so important. And finally, the more routes, the better. We need a route from aggregator to the utility time of use tariff. We need a route from aggregator to the RTO market, and then the IRP process.
Thank you. So we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to take a question from the audience. And the question is, what are your views on either legislative directed or PUC, PSC directed energy storage mandates? So of course, mandates have played a major role in renewable portfolio standards for wind. Is it time to have mandates for storage in order to try to jumpstart that? Thoughts?
To me, the economic justification for an out-of-market price subsidization is to give something a chance to compete at scale and to get the operational. There's some value there. Of course, all of this is a political game, and for me, the legislature, they're a lot easier to ask into your business than they are to ask out of your business once you've asked them in. And I spend a lot of time guarding that wall, and I'm not going to let anything crawl over that wall if I can. Now, I'm a creature, we're a creature of the legislature. That's something you constantly have to manage. To me, the reason we want to be flexible with respect to price, let the federal policy folks and the state, if they want to do that, they'll do that, and we want a mechanism where the changes in value that's mandated by policy automatically flows through. So if that happens, we're not litigating about what the policy should be for 2 years, we're deploying.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. I think Minnesota has governed a lot by legislative policy, and I think to the benefit of Minnesota. We have a renewable portfolio standard, we have a solar energy standard, we have long-standing energy efficiency that has delivered a lot of value. Do we need a solar mandate? I don't know. It seems to me we're making progress. I think what's tricky, as Ted said, once you invite them in, then it's up to the commission to define the rules of the road and the operating practices, and sometimes that can really be tricky and get in the way of just getting about the project that you want to see deploy.
I think we have time for one more audience question. So this question says, what can regulators do to ensure that the future of storage is not just in front of the meter and held by the utility, but that the future also facilitates adoption by end users and consumers?
I'm really glad Mary Powell is going to be our keynote from Green Mountain Power, because I think as a utility, as I understand it, their utility is getting it on the customer, getting storage on the customer side. Really interested to hear how they thought about that. I think we have a lot of road to go before we can really understand how to value all the customer-sided resources that are going to come, and the deployable big stuff, that's important. The deployable small stuff, that's important too. And I, as a regulator, have a lot less control over that unless somehow utilities and aggregators can get it together. But I think, it's going to come, and that's, look forward to hearing how that's going to come, and probably after I'm off the commission, that'll all be figured out.
You really got to have the aggregation thing. Talk about the IRP process, that's the utility side of it, and you might line up storage versus a peaker And those comparisons are made in the way they've always been made. If you want more than that, you need aggregation that takes advantage of time of use tariffs at the utility level and aggregation that takes advantage of the RTO markets. And we're also working on that. That's a whole nother complex wing of the building, is how do you get a capacity market right. And the energy markets work real good for most of these alternative technologies. The energy value alone isn't enough to make it economic. You need a capacity value too, and that's a difficult issue that we're working at the RTO level. So you have to stay engaged at the RTO level, and you need aggregation policy so they can plug directly into the RTO or into the utility.
One more comment from Chair Lange, and then we'll end.
Yeah, I just want to add, that's going to be, that kind of model is going to be imperative, because otherwise, if it's subsidization of technologies at the customer level, you know, that's not going to deliver the value that we need or the resource that we need. Hawaii is learning, you know, we can no longer pay customers a premium price to do things. We need to pay them not to do things, or we need to pay them at the value. And that's where I think the relationship between aggregators and utilities and RTOs is going to come in.
All right.
Thank you both, and please thank our wonderful panelists.